Welcome to another deep dive, everybody. Today we're going to be looking at incretin receptors.
It's good.
These receptors are really fascinating. They're involved in all sorts of important processes in the body,
Mhm.
like how our bodies manage blood sugar
Right.
and appetite and even digestion.
Exactly. It's really complex stuff.
Yeah, and we've got some research here that's going to help us really understand the nuts and bolts of how these receptors work. What do you say we jump right in?
Let's do it.
All right. So the research actually starts by taking us on a bit of a detour to the world of heart muscle cells.
Mm.
Um, those are also called cardiomyocytes.
Yeah.
So what's the connection there? Why are we talking about hearts when we're supposed to be focusing on incretin receptors?
Well, it all comes down to how cells receive and interpret signals. Cardiomyocytes, they've got these receptors. Beta-1 adrenergic receptors and EP4 receptors. Both of these receptors are coupled to G's proteins, which are kind of like these molecular messengers. And when you stimulate the beta-1 receptors with adrenaline, it makes the heart cell contract harder.
Okay, so that makes sense. Adrenaline, heart racing, stronger contractions.
Exactly.
But what about the EP4 receptors? What happens when those are activated?
Well, that's where things get interesting. When you activate the EP4 receptors with prostaglandin E2, it also activates the G's cascade.
Huh. So it's using the same pathway as the beta-1 receptors.
Right, but here's the thing. It doesn't have the same effect on contraction.
Really?
Yep, it doesn't make the heart beat harder.
So two receptors, same pathway, but different outcomes. That's pretty strange.
Yeah, and it actually challenges this old idea that signals just diffuse throughout a cell and have this universal effect. It seems like it's much more organized than that.
You mean like there are specific compartments within the cell where signals are directed?
Exactly. It points to the concept of signaling microdomains, these localized compartments where signals are concentrated.
Ah. So it's not just about the signal itself, but also about where it's received within the cell. That makes sense. So how are these microdomains created? What keeps the signals organized like that?
Well, that's where these things called A kinase anchoring proteins come in, or we can just call them AKPs.
AKPs, got it.
Think of AKPs as these cellular organizers. They're scaffold proteins that bind to a key enzyme in the signaling cascade called pKa, and then they hold the pKa in specific locations.
Okay, so they're like little anchors, making sure the signals get delivered to the right place.
That's a great way to put it. They're like the traffic cops of the cell, directing signals where they need to go.
Hmm.
This whole idea of microdomains, it makes you wonder, could this apply to incretin receptors too?
That's a great question. It seems like it could be a possibility. But before we get too ahead of ourselves, maybe we should back up a bit. Can you give us a quick rundown on exactly what incretin receptors are and what they do?
Sure. So incretin receptors are a type of receptor found on the surface of certain cells in the body. They respond to hormones called incretins.
Incretins.
And these incretins, they're released by the gut after we eat.
Ah, so it's like our bodies have a way of sensing when we've eaten and then responding accordingly.
Exactly. And one of the main things incretin receptors do is stimulate the release of insulin. Insulin is a hormone that helps regulate our blood sugar levels.
Right, that makes sense. So food comes in, the gut releases incretins activate incretin receptors, and then boom, more insulin is produced. It's a chain reaction.
You got it. And it all happens thanks to these amazing receptors, but, it's not just about insulin. Incretin receptors have other effects too.
Like what?
Well, for instance, they can also suppress appetite, make you feel fuller for longer.
Oh, interesting. So they're kind of like a built-in portion control system.
That's one way to think about it. And they can also slow down gastric emptying.
Gastric emptying. You mean like how fast food moves from the stomach into the intestines?
Exactly. That helps prevent those sharp spikes in blood sugar after a meal.
Wow, so they're really multi-talented receptors. It sounds like they play a pretty important role in keeping our bodies running smoothly. But you mentioned something about their connection to type 2 diabetes earlier. Can you explain that a bit more?
Yeah, so in type 2 diabetes, the body either doesn't produce enough insulin or it becomes resistant to the insulin it does make, and that leads to high blood sugar levels.
Right, and high blood sugar can cause all sorts of health problems. So how do incretin receptors fit into this picture?
Well, by targeting these receptors, we can essentially enhance the body's own natural mechanisms for controlling blood sugar. And that's where those GLP-1 receptor agonists that you mentioned earlier come in. They're drugs that mimic the effects of one of the incretin hormones, GLP-1.
Ah, okay, so they're basically tricking the body into producing more insulin and controlling blood sugar better. That's pretty clever.
It is. And it's just one example of how understanding these receptors can lead to new and innovative treatments for diabetes. But it's not just GLP-1. There's another incretin hormone called GIP, and it has its own receptor too.
GIP, huh? What does that one do?
Well, GIP also stimulates insulin release, but it seems like its effects might not be as strong in people with type 2 diabetes. There's still a lot we don't know about GIP and its role in the disease.
So it's possible that targeting both GLC-1 and GIP receptors could be even more effective.
That's what researchers are exploring. There's a lot of interest in developing drugs that activate both receptors at the same time, kind of like a 1-2 punch against diabetes.
That would be amazing. It sounds like we're just scratching the surface of what we can do with incretin receptors.
Oh, absolutely. There's so much more to learn. And the more we learn, the more potential we see for these receptors.
Well, I'm definitely eager to keep learning more. This is fascinating stuff.
Me too. For instance, remember how we were talking about signaling microdomains earlier?
Yeah, those little compartments where signals are concentrated.
Well, some researchers believe that those microdomains might actually play a key role in how incretin receptors function.
Really? Tell me more about that.
Well, it's possible that the receptors aren't just floating around randomly on the cell surface. They might actually be organized within these microdomains alongside other signaling molecules.
So instead of just sending out signals everywhere, they're strategically positioned to communicate with specific partners.
Exactly. And this could have a huge impact on how the receptors respond to different stimuli.
That's incredible. So are scientists actively studying this connection between incretin receptors and signaling microdomains?
Oh, yeah, for sure. It's a really hot area of research right now. There are labs all over the world trying to figure out exactly how these microdomains work and how they affect incretin receptor signaling.
This is really opening up a whole new layer of understanding about how these receptors work.
Hello.
I can't wait to see what else we discover. Are there any other exciting avenues of research in this field?
Oh, there are tons, but one that's particularly interesting right now is looking at the expression patterns of these receptors.
Expression patterns, you mean like where in the body these receptors are found?
Exactly. We know they're in the pancreas and the gut, but did you know that they're also found in the brain?
In the brain. Really?
Yeah, and that suggests that they might be involved in all sorts of other things besides just regulating blood sugar, like maybe mood, cognition, even neuroprotection.
Wow, that's amazing. So these receptors could potentially be involved in all sorts of things we never even imagined before.
That's the beauty of science. We're always uncovering new layers of complexity and discovering new possibilities.
Well, on that note, I think we're ready to dive into some of the cutting-edge research that's pushing the boundaries of what we know about these incredible receptors.
Sounds good to me. Let's do it.
So we're talking about these GLP-1 receptor agonists, and you know how they're used to treat type 2 diabetes. Can you kind of walk me through, like, how exactly they work? Like on a deeper level.
Okay, sure. So these GLP-1 receptor agonists, they're basically like little imposters.
Imposters.
Yeah, they mimic the action of GLP-1, that incretin hormone we were talking about.
Right. The one that tells the beta cells to make more insulin.
Yep, exactly. So these agonists, they bind to the GLP-1 receptor on those pancreatic beta cells.
Okay.
And then they trigger the same signaling cascade, the one that leads to, an increase in insulin production.
So it's like they're amplifying that signal.
Right.
Making the beta cells work even harder to produce insulin.
That's a great way to put it. And that's not all. They also have some other effects like natural GLP-1.
Yeah, you mentioned that they can affect appetite and gastric emptying too, right?
Right, exactly. So they're not just, boosting insulin production. They're also helping to control blood sugar in these other ways.
Wow, that's pretty impressive.
Yeah.
It's like a multi-pronged approach to managing diabetes.
Yep, exactly. And, that's what makes them so effective. They're not just, masking the symptoms. They're actually addressing some of the underlying causes of the disease.
That's really cool. So are there like different types of GLP-1 receptor agonists?
Yeah. There are actually quite a few different ones out there. And, they differ in their structure, how they're given, and how long they last in the body.
So like some might be taken daily, while others could be weekly or even monthly.
Exactly.
It sounds like there's a lot of variety out there.
Yeah, and that's a good thing. It means that doctors can really tailor the treatment to the individual needs of each patient, take into account their lifestyle and preferences and all that.
That makes sense. So all this talk about GLP-1, it makes me wonder about GIP, that other incretin hormone we were talking about.
Yeah.
Are there any therapies that, target the GIP receptor?
That's a great question, and it's something that researchers are definitely looking into. GIP also stimulates insulin release.
Right, we talked about that.
But it seems like, its effects might not be as noticeable. in people with type 2 diabetes.
So it's like the GIP receptor isn't as responsive in people with the disease?
Yeah, that's one possibility. There's still a lot we're learning about GIP and its role in diabetes, but there are some GIP receptor agonists in development.
Really?
Yeah, and some early studies are showing some pretty promising results.
Interesting. So is the idea that, by targeting both the GLP-1 and the GIP receptors, we could get even better outcomes for people with diabetes?
Exactly. That's the hope. There's a lot of interest in developing these dual incretin receptor agonists.
Dual agonists, so they would activate both receptors at the same time.
Yep. And some people think that this could be a really powerful approach to treating the disease.
That sounds amazing.
Yeah.
I mean, are there like any other strategies for targeting these pathways that people are working on?
Yeah, there are. Another approach is to focus on the enzyme that breaks down GLP-1 and GIP.
Oh, yeah. You're talking about DPP4, right?
Yep, that's the one. So the thinking is, if we can stop these hormones from being broken down so quickly, their effects will last longer.
So it's like giving those incretin signals a boost.
Exactly. And there are drugs that do this called DPP-4 inhibitors.
DPP4 inhibitors, got it.
And, studies have shown that they can be really effective in managing type 2 diabetes, just like the GLP-1 receptor agonists we were talking about.
It's really incredible to think about. We're basically harnessing these naturally occurring hormones to create these sophisticated therapies for diabetes. It's amazing what science can do.
I know, it's really exciting. All these advancements, they really highlight the importance of understanding how our bodies work and how we can use that knowledge to develop new and better treatments.
Well said. So, we've been talking a lot about the potential of these incretin receptors and how they could revolutionize the way you treat diabetes. But, it makes me think back to something we discussed earlier, the whole concept of signaling microdomains.
Oh, right, yeah. Those specialized compartments within cells.
Yeah, exactly. Do you think those could play a role in how incretin receptors function?
That's a really great question, and it's something that researchers are actively investigating right now. There's this growing idea that, these receptors might not be just floating around randomly on the cell surface.
Yeah.
They might be organized within these microdomains alongside other signaling molecules.
So it's like they're strategically placed to interact with specific partners, right?
Precisely. And, this could have a major impact on how those incretin receptors actually work and how they respond to different things.
That's fascinating. So are scientists actually studying this connection between incretin receptors and signaling microdomains? Like they're trying to figure out how it all works.
Oh, absolutely. It's a really exciting area of research. There are tons of labs all over the world that are working to unravel the complexities of these interactions.
It sounds like a really complex puzzle.
It is. But, every piece we uncover brings us closer to understanding these receptors and their full potential.
It's amazing to think that there's still so much more to learn. So, we've talked about the connection to microdomains, but are there any other kind of exciting areas of research that are happening right now with incretin receptors?
Definitely. One area that I find particularly interesting is the research on the expression patterns of these receptors.
Expression patterns, what do you mean by that?
Well, we've talked about how these receptors are found in the pancreas and the gut, right?
Right.
But did you know that they're also found in the brain?
Wait, really? In the brain. So those appetite-suppressing effects of GLP-1 we were talking about earlier, those are actually mediated by receptors in the brain.
Yeah, exactly.
Wow, that's incredible. So these receptors, they're not just about regulating blood sugar. They could also be involved in other things like maybe mood or cognition or even protecting the brain from damage.
That's right. It's still early days in terms of the research, but there's growing evidence that these receptors might have a much broader impact on our health than we initially thought.
This is also fascinating. It seems like with every new discovery, the potential of these receptors just keeps expanding. I can't wait to see what the future holds for this field.
Me too. We've come a long way in understanding the role of incretin receptors in diabetes, but there's still so much more to learn. And who knows what other amazing discoveries await us.
Well, on that note, I think we're ready to jump into some of the really cutting-edge research that's happening right now. The stuff that's really pushing the boundaries of what we know about these receptors.
Sounds good to me. Let's do it.
All right, so we've talked about how Incretin receptors might even be found in the brain. What's the latest on that research?
Well, there's growing evidence that these receptors in the brain, they could be involved in a lot of things, regulating mood, cognition, maybe even neuroprotection. For instance, there are studies that have shown that these GLP-1 receptor agonists, they might actually have some beneficial effects in animals with Alzheimer's disease and even Parkinson's disease.
Wow, that's incredible. So are we thinking these drugs, they could potentially be used to treat these neurodegenerative diseases in the future?
It's still too early to say for sure, but the research, it is looking really promising. Right now, there are clinical trials happening to actually investigate, how safe and effective these GLP-1 receptor agonists are in humans.
It's amazing how the possibilities just keep expanding with these receptors. What other areas of research are you really excited about?
Yeah, so one area that's really interesting to me is, investigating incretin receptor signaling at the molecular level. Remember, we were talking about those signaling microdomains before.
Right, right. Those specialized compartments within the cells.
Yeah, exactly. Well, researchers are now really digging deep into, what makes up these microdomains and how they change over time, and all to understand how they impact how those incretin receptors work.
Okay, so it's like we're going even deeper into the mechanics of how these signals are transmitted within the cell.
Exactly. For example, they're trying to identify the other proteins that hang out in those microdomains and figure out, like, how do they interact with those incretin receptors? This could even lead to new targets for drug development.
So by getting a really precise understanding of those microdomains, we could create even more targeted and more effective therapies.
Exactly. And that's what makes this research so exciting, right? It's not just about understanding basic biology. It's about taking what we learn and actually translating that into new treatments that can make a real difference for people.
I totally agree. It's been awesome exploring the world of incretin receptors with you. We started with blood sugar, then we ended up talking about like brain health and the complexity of how cells talk to each other.
It really shows, the power of scientific curiosity and how complex our bodies really are.
Well, that brings us to the end of our deep dive into the fascinating world of incretin receptors. We talked about their structure, their signaling pathways, all those different roles they play, and even those cool new therapies that are on the horizon.
I hope you learned something new today and that, maybe you're even a little bit more curious about science now.
Keep asking questions, everybody. Keep learning and keep exploring. Until next time.